By late 1944, as the Second World War entered its final and most desperate phase, the German High Command was searching for any chance to turn the tide. Hitler and his generals knew that the outcome of the war was no longer decided only by divisions at the front or by squadrons in the skies, but increasingly in the rear, where logistics, supplies, and resources mattered as much as tanks or aircraft. An army without fuel was an army already defeated. And it was fuel, more than anything else, that Germany no longer had. After the disaster at Kursk and the enormous losses on the Eastern Front, the once unstoppable German war machine had become a giant with feet of clay. It still possessed divisions, experienced officers, and even new weapons like the Tiger II tank and the Me-262 jet fighter. But all this power meant little without gasoline or diesel. Aircraft sat idle on runways. Tanks were hidden in forests, unable to move. Trucks, the lifeblood of infantry and artillery transport, rusted without fuel. Every barrel of fuel had become a strategic weapon. That is why, in December 1944, when the Ardennes Offensive, the last great German attack on the Western Front, was launched, capturing American fuel depots became one of the key objectives. In the first days of the offensive, German units achieved some successes. The Allies were caught off guard, American supply lines were torn apart, and confusion spread across the deep forests of the Ardennes. Amid this chaos, one episode seemed at first to be a remarkable stroke of fortune for the Wehrmacht. A German colonel and his men captured an American depot holding nearly 50,000 gallons of fuel. To exhausted crews and desperate logisticians, it seemed like a miracle. This was enough, they thought, to keep tanks rolling, to fuel trucks, to push forward toward the Meuse River. For the soldiers who had been waiting for days beside empty vehicles, for mechanics who cursed over dry tanks, the find was cause for celebration. Engines roared again in the winter air. The colonel's men cheered. But in that very moment, as he looked at this cache of desperately needed fuel, the colonel realized something far more profound. Germany was doomed, because in the scale of war, those 50,000 gallons meant almost nothing. A company of Tiger IIs could burn through that amount in days of combat. A division of trucks hauling supplies would drain it in less than a week. The entire Ardennes Offensive, Operation Wacht am Rhein, depended not on chance discoveries, but on capturing massive Allied stockpiles. Depots, refineries, convoys of tankers. German planners knew they had no reserves of their own. Their only hope was to steal what they needed along the way. The colonel understood the bitter truth. His soldiers rejoiced at this prize, but he knew it was a drop in the ocean. The offensive required millions of gallons of fuel. The Reich had gambled everything on one last throw of the dice. And if their grand strategy now depended on one lucky capture of a small depot, then the strategy itself was hollow. This realization chilled him more than the Ardennes winter. Germany was fighting a war of attrition against opponents who possessed limitless oil fields. Texas, the Middle East, North Africa. American and British tanks never stood idle for lack of fuel. Their aircraft flew by the hundreds, supported by endless convoys bringing supplies across the Atlantic. For the Allies, fuel was abundant, almost invisible, replaced as quickly as it was consumed. For Germany, every drop was precious. Each empty jerrycan was a death sentence. The captured depot symbolized the imbalance that defined the final year of the war. On the Eastern Front, millions of Red Army soldiers pressed forward, On the Western Front, the Allies were pushing relentlessly. German generals still moved markers across maps, planned operations, and issued orders. But their armies were strangled by shortages. Tanks and planes were useless without fuel. The greatest weapons of the Reich were becoming statues, steel monuments to a doomed cause. The colonel looked at the captured barrels, knowing they would allow his men to move a little farther, to perhaps win a skirmish, or destroy a handful of Shermans. But the end was inevitable. Once those tanks were empty again, nothing would replace the fuel. The offensive would stall. The Reich would collapse. It was in that moment, standing among the barrels of American gasoline, that the colonel saw Germany's fate clearly. Victory was no longer possible. The war had already been lost, not on the battlefield alone, but in the economy of resources. The Allies had more of everything: steel, trucks, men, aircraft, and above all, oil. Germany's last gamble in the Ardennes was already collapsing under its own weight. The scene was symbolic. German soldiers cheered over captured fuel, while across the Channel, Allied depots were so vast that the loss of 50,000 gallons was barely noticed. For the Americans, it was a logistical hiccup. For the Germans, it was a lifeline, one that only underscored their desperation. The colonel understood that history would not remember the barrels themselves, but the lesson they carried. An army that relies on captured enemy supplies is already finished. Germany had run out of time, out of options, and out of fuel, and so, even as his men pumped the precious gasoline into waiting tanks, even as engines roared back to life, the colonel knew the truth. This was not salvation. It was only a temporary reprieve. 50,000 gallons could not change the fate of the war. They could not alter the balance of resources or reverse the tide. They were a brief flicker of hope in the long night of defeat. And as he looked at those barrels, the colonel realized that Germany was doomed. Not in some distant future, but already, in that very moment.